We had technical issues on multiple fronts this morning, so I apologize in advance for having to read this from this laptop. I hope you don't find it too distracting. That Jesus was crucified is a matter of historical record. The historian Titus Flavius Josephus wrote of the event in his late 1st century work, Antiquities of the Jews. It happened. Documented. Historical. What his crucifixion means is a matter of perspective, position, faith. For ancient Romans, the most important thing about anyone who was crucified was the manner of their death. Death on the cross was such a shameful and humiliating way of being killed, even by ancient world standards, that Roman citizens wanted nothing to do with it. There was a Roman philosopher and statesman named Marcus Cicero. And Cicero was once defending a Roman senator in a murder trial, and he said this: "To bind a Roman citizen is a crime. To flog him, an abomination. To slay him is almost an act of murder. To crucify him is what? There is not a fitting word that can possibly describe so horrible a deed. The very word cross should be far removed, not only from the person of a Roman citizen, but from his thoughts, his eyes, and his ears." This was part of the intended consequence of crucifying someone, to ensure that the person who was killed was so utterly humiliated that nothing else about that person would be remembered. They would forever only be associated with the shame and the humiliation for how they died. And this was a pivotal part of maintaining the Roman Empire, of making sure that Roman citizens were favored above all other people, that they were known to be able to walk the earth without any kind of trouble, that they could expect to inherit all the riches and wealth that the Roman civilization had to offer, and that anyone who stood in their way would be seen as such a hated enemy, that they would be wiped off the face of the earth, known only for the disgrace and humiliation with which they died. This is how empire preserves and protects itself, by offering a carrot to some and a horrible mighty stick to everyone else. If everything had gone according to plan, we would not know the name Jesus of Nazareth. And we certainly would not be here worshiping his way and worshiping the God he represented. After his 40 days in the desert, after his trials with the devil, Jesus spends the rest of his earthly life revealing the difference between the ways of the world and the ways of God. His spiritual journey in the wilderness opened his eyes to the way God moves and works in the world, and how it is starkly different from the way the world chooses to move and work. In his time and place, the cultural values and norms of the Roman Empire were so pervasive that they even influenced people like his fellow occupied Israelites. Even people who had no hope of ever being a Roman citizen could not help but take in the values and the norms of the Roman Empire. All around him, Jesus saw Roman soldiers, Jewish kings, religious leaders, occupied Israelite merchants and peasants. Everyone was doing whatever they could to gain as much honor and wealth for themselves in order to be a little above the pack, to rise above the others, just enough to make sure that they would have an easier way of life than someone else. These are the things Jesus rejected when Satan offered them to him. And in that rejection of Satan, it enabled Jesus to teach others, what will it profit you to gain the whole world if it requires you to forfeit your life? And when we find Jesus in our story today, his disciples, his closest followers, have just realized who he really is. That he's not just a rabbi, he's not just a teacher, not just a healer. He is God's Messiah. And they expect God's Messiah to use God's mighty powers the way the world uses its mighty powers. They expect him to overthrow the Roman Empire, to bring an end to their violent occupation, to lay waste to the armies of their enemies, to preserve and protect and save the chosen few. And yet again, Jesus reveals to them how very different God's way of wielding power is from the world's way of wielding power. Jesus says to them, I have to go to the holy city of Jerusalem, not to conquer it, but to suffer at the hands of earthly power, to demonstrate that earthly power will never conquer God. Peter finds this so difficult to believe. This is in such contrast to how he and the other disciples understand God's power to work. It is so against their understanding of who God is and how God's Messiah is expected to act that Peter finds himself begging Jesus just to say it isn't so. God forbid this, Lord. This couldn't possibly happen to you. But again, Jesus is totally clear about what he's expected to do. He is expected to work his power the way God works God's power. And he looks at Peter, one of his closest friends, a man who just minutes before he called the rock on which I will build my church. He looks at this very man and says to him, "Get behind me, Satan. You do not compete with the expectations of God." And as if the stark contrast between God's way and the way of the world hadn't been made strong enough, they've been following Jesus for weeks or months. They've seen him heal. They've seen him preach and teach. As if the contrast between the way Rome operated and the way God operated isn't strong enough. In this particular teaching, Jesus invokes the image of the cross, a word that Roman citizens don't even want disgracing their ears. Jesus says his followers will be known as those who pick up their cross and follow. This is the final lesson he will teach the disciples. It's the greatest revelation about the contrast between the way of God and the way of the world. It's a lesson so difficult to learn that even Jesus' closest disciples refuse to hear it. But it is this lesson we refer to when we talk about the mystery of the cross. And it's how Jesus himself identifies his followers. Followers of Jesus are willing to carry the burden of humiliation and shame in order to serve others. Followers of Jesus are willing to be marked by failure and death to reject power and privilege. Followers of Jesus lose themselves in the world in order to find themselves in eternity. This is the contrast between the love that the world teaches and the love that God offers. The world teaches in romantic poetry about platonic ideals of a love that never touches conflict, never sees a dark day. Lovers who are always perfect, soaring together to the highest heights. The love we come to know in God the love offered by God, is markedly different. It is a love that does not quit when times are tough. It is not a love constrained by rules, by do's and don'ts. It is a love that roams freely and dangerously, challenging the social structure of every civilization in all time. It is a love that is not shattered by conflict, but deepened by it. It is a love that is not reserved for one person or a special group of people, but poured out freely for all humanity and all creation. It is a love that embraces what the civilized world doesn't even want to hear about. It's this love that identifies us as followers of Jesus. When two or more of us are willing to do this, we create a beloved community, uniting with other followers to practice this deeper love among one another so that we might learn how to share it with the wider world. In beloved community, the way of being community that we try to practice here in this church, we discover how to follow in the way of God rather than the way of the world. It shouldn't be a mystery why we have spent the last 4 weeks of Lent focusing so much on ourselves as individuals, focusing on our own spiritual journey. Because if we can't go through those steps, if we can't get our own internal situation oriented towards God's ways, we have no way of joining together in this alternative way of being. Without the revelation that God is found not at the heights of life, but in the depths. Without the revelation that God is not found in earthly pleasures and riches, but in walking away from such things. Without those revelations, we have no language. We have no idea what it looks like to come together as God's beloved who are called to pick up their cross, to touch and embrace shame, humiliation, frustration, hardship, to bear one another through the darkest of days, through the greatest of struggles. Since the Roman Empire, the powers of the world have done whatever they can to avoid shame, to protect power, to preserve privilege. And Jesus reveals that only by picking up the cross, by picking up the burdens that the world sets at our feet, only then can we learn to embrace our God. We are taught our entire lives to worship power, to crave privilege, to long for certainty and safety. But it's at the table where we come face to face with a crucified Messiah that we truly come to understand how God calls us to be and what is worth our worship. This was Jesus' final and most important teaching. Teaching not the way of empire, but the way of God. Not called to model ourselves after a community of a special few, but called to model ourselves after a love that no empire can conquer, that no death can overcome. The thing is, it can't be learned by word alone. We don't learn how to love. We don't learn how to practice this love just by reading it in an ancient text. It's something we can only learn and practice with one another in beloved community. Jesus had to have his trials in the desert before he could learn it. The disciples, no matter how often Jesus talked about it, they couldn't process it, they couldn't understand it until they saw Jesus crucified for themselves and experienced what happened next. And friends, we are given an experience at least once a month where we gather together as church and we come to the table to learn the greatest lesson Jesus had to teach by experiencing it for ourselves. The mystery of the cross, the place where everyone fears to go, which is also the space God requires to work wonders and renew creation. We have to be willing to not just hear this word, to not just hear the word that shames and offends so many. We have to be willing to go and touch it. So come, beloved, come to the table and learn about this God of ours together. This God that defeat only deepens. This God whose love does not quit in suffering or in death. Come and learn, experience it together in this meal of communion. Please join in singing the song found in the insert in your bulletin.